Hollow Knight is a great game that has received great recognition for all of its strong traits. Among these strong traits are smooth gameplay, subtle storytelling, engaging combat, and epic boss fights. They all work together to create this masterpiece of a game. However, I don't want to talk about any of these. Instead, I want to talk about what is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of Hollow Knight: the soundtrack. I love soundtracks in video games so much, and the music that is a part of these soundtracks can change the entire feeling of a game, from the atmosphere to the emotions that you feel during certain moments, and this works especially well whenever it's done masterfully. If you have amazing gameplay elements that are not backed up by a soundtrack, your game likely isn't going to be up to par. You can have a great game with great gameplay elements and great story, but if the soundtrack falls short, it isn't going to do well. The Hollow Knight soundtrack is one that has been expertly crafted within several aspects of the game and has impressed me to this day. The entire soundtrack communicates so well with the rest of the game that, to me, it is stunningly beautiful and completely breathtaking. It allows the kingdom of Hallownest to be built around its music and plays a critical role in conveying the atmosphere of specific locations. It also plays a large role in telling the story of Hallownest and conveying the emotions that go with it. On top of all of this, it also emphasizes the bosses, with the music encapsulating not only the boss, but the environments around the boss, the emotions that the boss has to convey, and the dramatic and adrenaline-inducing feeling when you first encounter a boss. In other words, this soundtrack, in my opinion, is too good to not talk about. So I did. Hi. My name is Sasquatch. Before this video starts, if you haven't played Hollow Knight by now, this is your spoiler warning here. The soundtrack of this video game is way too much inside of itself and intertwined with the rest of the story, the bosses, and several of the important areas of the game. In order for me to convey the points I am trying to, and to show off the musical excellence of the soundtrack, I have to explain the story, and I have to show spoilers in this video. I will try to keep the spoilers of the story in the actual story section, but this is a heads up because I'm also going to be putting in background gameplay. If you haven't played this game though, seriously, go play it. Right now is as good a time as any, as Silksong will be coming out hopefully later this year. If you have played Hollow Knight, then strap in, because you and I are going to go on a journey across every corner of Hallownest, from the top of the Howling Cliffs down to the depths of the abyss. I'm going to cover a lot of this game's music, and I will try to make sure that I explain all of my thoughts in detail. With all of that said, there is still so much to unpack here, so let's get started. This is my musical analysis of Hollow Knight. Music theory and an overview. As it relates to Hollow Knight and all music in general, there was always a little bit of backbone theory to go behind it. For those of you that aren't interested in the theory, I'm not going to talk about it too long, so don't worry. But the reason why this section is here is to dissect a couple of cases where music theory is common throughout Hollow Knight, and also to discuss how it relates to my undying love for the soundtrack, as well as the relationship between the theory and the actual feelings that it gives. The first one is the exceptional use of minor scales. Hallownest is lost and dying and completely abandoned. So the use of music that conveys sorrow, uncertainty, and fear are very fitting. Minor keys fit directly into this mold. These scales and keys give those vibes that Hallownest has, and Christopher Larkin's use of them throughout Hollow Knight gives Hallownest the vibe of a forgotten and infected kingdom. However, there also are the spots where more happy, beautiful, or calming tracks are the right solution. Major keys fit into these spots. Larkin, like all composers, uses both major keys and minor keys in conjunction with each other to convey different emotions at different points in the game. When the situation seems more dire, then the use of a foreboding and scary track is used. Contrarily, if the situation seems more calm, then the use of a soothing track is better. I didn't want to talk about just the use of minor and major keys though. They're everywhere and everyone uses them. All musicians would. Instead, I want to emphasize the mastery of switching between the two that Larkin has, as well as the way that Larkin conveys emotion through them. These compositions being written by Larkin are all fitting directly into the scenario that the player is currently in. This makes the music more captivating and more interesting, and allows the experience of the game to be more captivating and more encapsulating. It allows for the adjustment of an atmosphere and the change into a boss theme. As a quick example, think about the Forgotten Crossroads and the first encounter with the False Knight. The game makes it obvious that something of a boss is lying ahead inside of the arena, but the music doesn't make that known until the Forgotten Crossroads track fades away and you see the false knight fall on your screen. This is when the music kicks up into an epic theme that fits the false knight fight, and gives the player a cool soundtrack to fight the boss to. This is just an easy example of something that happens several times in Hollow Knight, where Larkin communicates what the player should be feeling in a given area or in a given moment. Even just opening and starting the game, you get the emotions of mystery and hope while you watch the cutscene and hear the leitmotifs. We'll talk about the leitmotifs later, but for now let's just focus on the emotions. Larkin seamlessly matches the feelings of both environments and bosses together. Green Path sounds alive in the music, and Dung Defender sounds heroic in nature, just for a couple of examples. This is even without knowing anything about the area or the character. This is just listening to their soundtrack. This is what determines the difference between Hollow Knight and other games, in my opinion. The music is 100% reflective of what is happening on the screen. The emotions that the music provides the player are hand in hand with the cutscenes that play. This is what makes Hollow Knight's music as a whole super engaging to me, and puts it ahead of many games for me. So let's take all of these ideas and apply them to the Kingdom of Hallownest and to Hollow Knight while playing it. Let's start talking about the environment and the atmosphere. Atmospheric and environmental music. One of the first musical elements that caught my ear was the way that the environment and the soundtrack click together like puzzle pieces. When it comes to atmosphere, Hollow Knight has the best of the best. All of the soundtracks fit right in with the areas that you explore throughout the Kingdom of Hallownest. Now, before you say in the comments that some of the areas don't have soundtracks, they do have ambience. And in case you forgot, Christopher Larkin gets credited with both sound design and music. So while these tracks aren't quote-unquote official soundtracks, they are still music that contributes to the atmosphere, environment, and overall feel of the game. But anyways, small rant aside, let's talk about the environment. There are a lot of areas in Hollow Knight. Some of them are absolutely beautiful. Some of them are made of, well, you know. But this is intentional. Every area in the game has music that is perfectly adjusted to that environment. So much so that sometimes it'll feel like the game has grabbed you and sucked you right into it. It is incredible the amount of immersion that is present in Hollow Knight, even when the soundtrack is just silent. There are so many areas in Hollow Knight, but of course, we've got to start with the Forgotten Crossroads. The Forgotten Crossroads is dusty, dirty, dilapidated, destroyed. It's forgotten, like the name states. The soundtrack embodies this by being mellow and just having a slow track in general. Slow piano chords with strings that lay within it. Eventually, this progresses into a tiny melody and fades in and out of the track. It is super simple, and yet it holds so much value. It completes the feeling of this place being used for something before it was forgotten. It is a hopeful area full of memories of the past, things that used to exist. You can even see evidence of this in-game. Cargo is spread throughout all of the area, and the cracked walls and dusty grounds really give an emphasis on the old rotting roadway. It is very immersive with both the music and the visuals. And speaking of immersion, in the soundtrack, there's a section that is more combat oriented to give you the track that you hear when you're fighting an enemy arena or a large hulking husk. This track gives intensity to the situation you're in, and it is a common theme throughout many different tracks later in the game. Even the Ancestral Mound has this soundtrack that embodies the area that you're in, including tribal percussion and some kind of pan flute sound. This section of the track shows that this mound could be even older than the crossroads themselves, and hint at a potentially ancient tribal civilization. The music is progressive, and plays at the appropriate time, while exploring, fighting, or entering a sub-area. All of this provides the game with the much-needed music to allow the atmosphere to flourish. And of course, speaking of flourishing, let's talk about Green Path. The soundtrack to Green Path sounds alive. It has a very light melodic line that gives it this sparkling effect in your ears. The glockenspiel, harp, winds, and strings work together to make a line that gives a sense of life, and the abundance of it. The music complements the actual look and visuals of Green Path as well, thanks to the overgrown greenery and flora that thrive in the environment. This makes it look and sound alive. In fact, this sounds like you're in a jungle, or that you're in an enchanting forest. This gets enhanced later by the marimba, bassoon, and tuba that enter in and trade around the melodic line. Green Path also has a combat theme, and it includes upbeat lines and more intense instrumentation as well, just like the Forgotten Crossroads. Every aspect of this soundtrack enhances the idea that this place is abundant and flourishing in the conditions that it is in. It truly puts life into Greenpath. Continuing down the progression path, you will eventually encounter Fungal Wastes, which is also alive, but differently than Greenpath. This was my favorite environmental track for a long time. In fact, it was my favorite soundtrack for quite some time during the game. It contains this bouncy background with a curious melodic line, something that you might hear when you're viewing a documentary. It has many texture layers and contains a leitmotif of the title screen music in the string part at the beginning of the musical lines. If you listen closely, you can hear it. It has a very curious soundtrack overall, which fits in perfectly with the sentient mushrooms that live in the habitat. The track gives an immersive atmosphere immediately by bringing your attention to it with a cymbal scrape and some staccato string bass notes. Behind all of it are some winds that rise and fall, giving the background of the piece, as well as a guitar that strums quarter notes while it gets louder and softer throughout the whole thing. Continuing with the staccato idea, that means short in music language, it layers the theme of the vessel over everything, the main menu music, but short and played by strings. Then the true melody enters. This is played by a clarinet. This musical line is incredibly indicative of the variety of mushrooms, mantises, and other creatures that thrive in this environment, as well as the environment itself. Later on in the piece, a euphonium takes over the melody and provides a nice contrast to the clarinet. This all ties together to create the track that you hear in the game, and it's incredibly special to me because this is the track that I would get lost in. The fact that it even matches the mantises that inhabit the fungal wastes with some slight alteration to the original track is incredible. I got caught up in this area so many times because I would simply wander around. I would explore, fight enemies, and take the occasional dunk into acid, but it captivated me and kept me there while I explored this strange, unknown habitat. This track is also what started my love for the atmosphere of this game, and it made me go back and listen to the other tracks like Greenpath and Forgotten Crossroads. It affected the way I saw soundtracks later on in the game too, like when I made it to Royal Waterways. Areas like this mutated sewer have more of a dark sounding track. They hint at more dangerous areas than you've experienced before. The waterways are an area that has been mutated and infested with abominations called flukes. These flukes are quite dangerous, and the soundtrack matches this by having low cello notes that resonate throughout what sounds like a hallway. They sound like they're being played just in a sewer, like you're in. This is pretty much the only instrument that makes this track though. However, the solo cello emphasizes that there isn't much life down here in the first place, and that the life that is down here is really deformed. This area also has the bonus of giving you the amazing ASMR experience of having a fluke in squishy pursuit of you while you try to run away and kill the abhorrent creature. If you're experiencing this for the first time, an area like the waterways can be pretty unsettling and really creepy in some cases, but there is a track that is far creepier than this. Deep Nest and Scary go hand in hand. In fact, Deep Nest does it way better than Waterways does, with an emphasis on uncomfortable, high-pitched screeching sounds. Now, the atmosphere in Deep Nest and the Waterways are different, so I think that the scarier ambience for Deep Nest fits much better, and is more warranted for Deep Nest, especially since Deep Nest is quite literally a massive spiderweb. With the movement of the directional sound through your headphones, you can feel the vibrations of the ambience going through your head. Seriously, go listen to it. Close your eyes and listen to it at a high volume with a stereo set of headphones. You'll hear it move throughout your ears and get into your head. It feels really strange, but it works super well in unnerving the player. The sound of clashing tones and screeching strings is a common trope in horror games, and it's used here to emphasize the idea that you're not safe. These elements build suspense that ultimately climaxes whenever a creepy crawly jumps out from the ground to nibble at your little feet. While Deep Nest doesn't have a soundtrack for it, or quote-unquote music, it is still masterfully crafted, and it still gives you the feeling of danger, scares, and horror. It's just like you can feel them crawling around in your head. Ugh. In complete contrast, the soundtrack to The City of Tears is full of hope, beauty, and calmness. Despite the number of enemies in this area, the soundtrack still manages to pull out some of the best and most fitting music I've ever heard in a video game. Not only that, but it builds. This happens a lot in Hollow Knight as well. Later in the game, the music will start to build and eventually find a climax. The track starts as a harp and a piano melody that repeats itself, and from there, the layers begin to stack on. A vocal line enters the music, beautiful and pure, and not too long after, you hear some quiet strings in the background. These will provide a firm foundation as more textures enter. Most notably, The next one is bass. These bass notes provide much needed low voices to the infantry of higher ones. While the music continues to build, we get the inclusion of a choir and several more instruments, all the way from woodwinds to accompanying percussion. Then there are some changes to the climax, but it all starts to fade out as, once again, a combat theme begins to develop. The harp and piano figure quiet down quite a lot to make room for the syncopated or offbeat string feature. This serves as the combat theme for the City of Tears, and the whole thing is as beautiful as it can be. It captures the feeling for the entire area, a beautiful capital to a once active kingdom. And then you find Soul Sanctum. Soul Sanctum is interesting. As an extension of the City of Tears, it too includes the ostinato, or repeated figure, but played by an organ this time rather than a harp and piano. It is a modified version of the original City of Tears track. However, in this one there are dark undertones. These dark undertones emphasize the way that this area presents itself. The story here allows for the track to be particularly dark, but that's getting ahead of myself a little bit. Regardless, without knowing the story, the music still sounds dark and gloomy. The organ gives a sense of forbidden knowledge that is possessed by the creatures that lurk around, and the boss fight at the end sounds super epic and super fun, and whenever you eventually beat it, it feels like you've just released a piece that hasn't been there before. All of this makes up an environment, and all of it immerses you in Hollow Knight. Each of these environments is fully and entirely 100% the greatest environments that I've ever played a video game in, and the environmental music in this game is, again, 100% the best music that I've heard atmospherically. All of these points hit the mark exactly the way you want them to. Sub-areas like the Soul Sanctum, Mantis Village, and the different kinds of mounds have perfectly crafted soundtracks with musical language strewn throughout. Even whenever the crossroads become infected, there's a brand new track. This new track emphasizes the new infection that is spread throughout the crossroads, and it makes the infection significant by including a new title for the area, a changed soundtrack, new enemies, and entirely new lore elements. The environmental music in this game is just spot on, and it always changes and adapts to where you are and the conditions of the area surrounding you. It is done incredibly well and has several music ideas that are just so good. These are also expanded on as you travel into deeper parts of the game. Places like the Abyss that I didn't talk about because story reasons. Sometimes, though, the music stops. The sounds get quiet. Everything is still. And then bosses are easily the biggest highlight of Hollow Knight. From False Knight to Dung Defender and Mantis Lord to the Hollow Knight itself, every single boss has a unique feel. Each one has its own personality and its own story behind it. With all that said then, it is not surprising that all of them have really, really good soundtracks. There are several soundtracks dedicated to simply bosses, and there are even some bosses that have their soundtrack integrated with their environment's soundtrack. Whatever the case may be, each one has a well-crafted track that encapsulates the feeling of that specific boss. The only exceptions to this rule are the bosses that share soundtracks, mostly ones that use Decisive Battle, or what the generic boss theme is called. Other than that though, there aren't many bosses that share music, and even the generic tracks have so much depth to them. There are so many bosses, and obviously I can't cover them all with just this video, but if you would like to see me talk about some of these other bosses and their music, hit the like button and leave a comment down below telling me which boss you want to cover. Anyway, the bosses I'm going to cover are going to be a select few of the bosses that stuck out to me while I was making this video. Plus, some of them just really segue nicely into each other, so it works out. So, without further ado, I'm going to select Nosk as my first boss. We already talked about how Deep Nest is a horrifying labyrinth of twisting tunnels and creepy crawlies, but Nosk takes this to a new level. Nosk is a hunter, and much like the creatures in Deep Nest, Nosk hunts for its food. Any bug that is unfortunate enough to find themselves in Nosk's lair will be lured in and eviscerated. The soundtrack is a product of the buildup of this fight, and the release of suspense whenever Nosk reveals itself. In fact, I believe that Nosk is proof that Team Cherry could make a horror game if they wanted to. The way that you discover discover Nosk through some secret passageways in the already confusing Deep Nest really just grasps your attention and pulls you in. It gives you that feeling of you can't look away. While traveling through these specific passageways, you realize that this is home to a different monster. Dead bugs littered throughout the passageways, and you begin to see what looks like yourself? Copies of the night begin to show up, and they disappear when you reach their location. This is another tactic. This lures you in and grabs your attention. As you go deeper and you examine the Dreamnail dialogue of some of these dead bugs, you realize that this may not be just some simple spider. You keep seeing yourself as you travel deeper, but you don't know if it's the insanity that's finally caught up to you or if it's some death trap. Maybe you're just seeing things. Surely there's not another character like you. Still, further deeper. Eventually, you find yourself in a long tunnel. Taking a step in, you hear a horrifying snap. You cannot escape, and your only option is to move forward. And while you go forward, you hear more snapping. When you look back, you see these almost organic doors that block you from leaving. Whatever resides here does not want you to leave. Then you see it, the copy of the night, the copy of you. As you approach, the seemingly identical character shrieks and begins to transform. You hear the snapping and cracking of what unnervingly sounds like bones as the creature takes form in front of you. Once again, the scream of the beast rings out as it charges you. Then, the soundtrack begins. Fear strikes into your heart as you hear it ramp up. Just as a reminder, all of this is build-up. In fact, up until that last part, I wasn't even talking about the soundtrack. First and foremost, the track hits you with a bang. It scares you. Loud tribal drums, haunting strings, and big accents are what are present here. Not only that, but it changes from a steady 8th note pulse into an erratic triplet pulse. When I say pulse, I mean the difference between the placements of accents in the music. So hearing 2 versus hearing 3. This might be confusing, so just try to hold on for a second. The switching between these pulses gives unpredictability and emphasizes Nosk's character, and his behavior, quite frankly. The way that it attacks you, the way that it erratically jumps at you, rampantly running and shrieking and spewing infection everywhere. It's unnerving. On top of this, there are some very common horror tropes that are included in the soundtrack. Screeching strings are mostly what drive this. They have classic trills and stingers that we talked about with the Deep Nest soundtrack. They return here in the Nosk fight, and they are not backing down at all. In fact, so many of them are present that it sounds chaotic, and, well, it's kind of supposed to be. There is pattern, though. Pattern in the dynamics. The pattern is as follows. Really loud and scary, then quieting down to pretty much nothing, and then suddenly becoming loud again to jump scare you. This is also some kind of allusion to Nosk's hunting tendencies. Nosk will stalk its prey, use lure tactics to coax bugs into his trap, and once the prey has taken the bait, Nosk will ambush it. The music reflects this with exponential dynamic changes, and forte whenever things are getting ambushed, and quieting down whenever Nosk is sneaking around. The instrumentation piggybacks off of the classic horror tropes, and the dynamics give you this feeling that you're being stalked. This is like a horror film or a horror game. The use of big accents gives urgency to the music and communicates that the situation is very, very dire. This music is stressful. It plays right into the character of Nosk, and it's meant to scare you. Erratic, unpredictable, horrifying. This is pretty much what Nosk is. Honestly, I think this track is probably one of my favorite boss tracks in the game, especially considering how well it plays into Nosk's character. This track is jarring. It's supposed to be, and that's what I love about it. Not only that, but Nosk skittering around is almost like the strings going up and down this scalar pattern, almost as if the music itself is hunting you. But hey, at least you get some pale ore out of the crippling PTSD of this boss fight, right? Right? The next boss on my list is Dung Defender. Now, I initially wasn't going to include Dung Defender, but it grew on me quite a lot, so while I was listening to it over and over, I couldn't help but include it. Plus, it ties well into some future tracks. The driving brass melody and the snare drum playing behind gives this fight a lot of character before you even know anything about Dung Defender itself. This is a fight with someone heroic, maybe even royalty, and that's pretty good reflection of what Dung Defender is. Each of the parts of the track is moving, like an army marching to war. The textures of various percussion keyboards, harps, and running string lines add also quite a lot of good texture. All of this gives this character some unnecessary importance. at least at first glance. See, that's what I would say until you find out who Dung Defender actually is. Once you do find out who Dung Defender is, the heroic track makes a lot more sense. The track communicates a hero, a warrior, someone who fights, and someone who is a battler. We see later in the game with dialogue from Dung Defender that he is hopeful for the return of the kingdom of Hallownest and the Pale King. He is one of the great knights of Hallownest, one of 5, which of course is a pretty obscure lore detail, but that's beside the point. Regardless, based on the music alone, the lore detail becomes a lot more evident and clear, and you could probably guess that Dung Defender is part of some kind of heroic or royalty or some kind of something that's important based on just the soundtrack by itself. This is a theme that we're going to be discussing a lot. Basically, the boss music will allude something that gets revealed about the boss later. In fact, it happens quite a lot in Hollow Knight, and if you look for it, you will find it. I really believe that with the music and the story, this will make the lore a lot more digestible to the average player. In fact, some of the lore details of this game were revealed to me through songs, through things that I heard, and through music. I put context clues together and eventually figured out some of the things about this story that maybe some other people may not have heard. Anyway, I'm getting off track a little bit. My point is, this soundtrack makes it a lot more digestible to understand that Dung Defender is someone with some importance to Hallownest, or at least some importance to the Royal Waterways, since he guards Isma's Grove. So with that in mind, let's move on to Broken Vessel. Broken Vessel, kind of like Dung Defender, is a very story-driven boss, even more so than Dung Defender. But the soundtrack is absolutely immaculate. When you're going through Ancient Basin, you hear literally nothing, just a little bit of silent ambience, maybe, and an echo that happens whenever you're stepping around or you hear one of the little crawly creatures crittering around. Though, whenever you're going through, you still encounter a small buildup for this fight, mostly infected seeds running around, but you also have to travel an entire area before you get to this boss. Once you encounter the arena, you see a dead vessel in front of you, and when you approach it, seeds will begin to infect it. And this is where the fight begins. The vessel theme is very prevalent here, as it's a callback to False Knight and the main menu music, but this time it's in a marching 3/4 time, 3 beats per measure. This track gives some low cello notes that give an ostinato, or repeated, section that marches up and down a minor scale. That's the musical theoretical definition of it. Basically, it's the bass line, the foundation. It's heard throughout the entire rest of the track. Eventually, you will hear another string on top of this, with, of course, the vessel theme. It plays that theme over the bass notes that are underneath it. The same theme that plays for the main menu is present in this boss fight. This theme, paired with increased tempo, staccato bass lines, which means short, and legato melody, which legato means long, this creates a new track that evokes a new feeling in a new context. The track is mellow and sorrowful, and it is dreadful that you have to fight another one of your own taken by the infection. The music also feels a lot more personal than some of the other boss fights previously. It really emphasizes the duel-like nature of this fight. It feels like two brothers fighting each other, and of course, the story of this boss fight has to be much deeper than you think it is at first glance. With the story of this battle known, just like Dung Defender, it makes more sense. This track is sad, mellow, sorrowful, because the broken vessel is your sibling. The broken vessel is a vessel that escaped the abyss and died shortly after. With the help of the infection, it's able to come back to life, but not sentiently. It doesn't have free will. Instead, it returns as a slave to the infection, a zombie with nothing to live for other than the light inside of its infected body. This is an incredibly sad fate for this vessel. You end up having to kill it, and as it finally finds its peaceful rest, it reaches out to you, which is incredibly impactful. No other boss does that. Not only that, but this fight always stuck out to me as one of the turning points in this game. Not only musically, because some of the boss tracks are not quite like this one previously, but also within the gameplay. It blocks off the Monarch Wings, and once you grab the Monarch Wings, the crossroads become infected, assuming you don't already have a Dreamer. This boss is a very crucial part of the game. It provides a transition from around the early mid-game into the full late-game portion of the game, and this boss also held my favorite battle and my favorite soundtrack soundtrack for a long time. The way that the track not only connects the story, but flows with the battle, and communicates the ancient basin as well, you could probably see why it was my favorite for a while. The fight of the broken vessel isn't even particularly challenging, but the music absolutely goes hand in hand with the fight. That's what made it so much better for me. If you remember, I talked about immersion and captivating the player earlier in the environment section of the video. Well, Larkin blew it out of the water with this one. Absolute musical perfection. The duel-like nature of the fight is communicated through the marching heavy feel of the track. This fight occurs deep underground, in a dark area, without much life, and it still communicates that even though the ancient basin itself has no soundtrack. Even with all of that, the Broken Vessel soundtrack still fits in the boss, the flow, the aesthetic, and where it's located. Plus, the use of a minor scale here is huge. Basically, the reason why this soundtrack sounds so sad is because of the way the minor key here is represented. The way that the track dances around the scale highlights the absence of life, the presence of the broken vessel, and it expresses the conflicted emotions that you'll feel as a byproduct of the battle. This is probably my favorite example of the music being immersive, emotional, and matching to the rest of the game. Broken Vessel highlights exactly what a sad, conflicting boss should feel like. When you finish this fight and you kill the Broken Vessel and you see it reach out to you, you don't feel good, and there's some doubt and questioning into what you're doing. Doubt in whether or not you should continue, and whether or not you're even doing the right thing in the first place. This is what I love about Broken Vessel's soundtrack. It's a representation of a tragedy that you haven't uncovered yet, and there's still a lot of context behind it. How did the vessel die? Where did the vessel come from? Things like that. Things that you don't know yet. In fact, even the question of there are more vessels comes to mind whenever you are fighting this boss. This boss fight is a tragedy, and it highlights that. This is your sibling, and you have to kill it. I mean, the dream fight of this boss is called Lost Kin for a reason. Speaking of kin, I'm pretty much done with talking about Broken Vessel, so let's talk about another one of the Knight's siblings. Hornet is easily the most iconic character in the game, aside from the Knight itself. Hornet's soundtrack is also just as iconic. She's a very important character in this game. The soundtrack kicks that off right from the start. When I heard this boss theme in Green Path, I knew that the bosses in Hollow Knight were going to be absolutely so good. They were going to be different from any other game that I'd ever played. I was right, too. Hornet's soundtrack is very epic, I'll call it. It starts off with big orchestral string hits, and it maintains this playful and bouncy atmosphere. This is the kind of emphasis that I want to cover in this soundtrack. Hornet is a very serious character. I'm not doubting that at all, and the soundtrack does match it. However, Hornet's battles are brighter and more playful than something like Broken Vessel or Watcher Knights. Hornet feels much more happy than these other bosses might. Hornet feels more like a joy to fight rather than a horrifying tragedy. This track sounds majestic and upbeat, and it reflects on Hornet's attributes as a character, just like I was talking about with Nosk. She doesn't want to straight up kill you, she just wants what is best for the Kingdom of Hallownest. It also isn't revealed until later that she is royalty, which the track also brings out with piano and strings kind of intertwining together and bringing out that feel. Now obviously you're not thinking, oh, she's royalty at the time, but once you find out, you can reference it back to the soundtrack and hear it. The whole thing honestly sounds like you're in a fight, but not really a fight like you're fighting to the death, but more like a sparring match. Later on, when she challenges you in the Kingdom's Edge, the fight is still much more serious and more mature about the whole situation. Still, it has this underlying playfulness, and honestly, hearing the soundtrack in two different contexts changes the sound. In the Kingdom's Edge, it's emphasizing the seriousness of the fight and what it means to Hornet. Her soundtrack does have a lot of story elements. Her soundtrack is a call to several themes in the game, and it gets tied to some other themes in the future. The cooperation of piano, strings, and horns all work in such good harmony together. This soundtrack is musically masterful. The bass line goes really well with the melody, and the string runs that you hear will send you spiraling into joyful ascension. It's such a good track, and it sets the tone really well as a starting boss of Hollow Knight. If you didn't get the message from False Knight that these bosses are different, Hornet will definitely give you that feel. Plus, as a little bit of a musical note, the piano and strings have this amazing polyrhythm section, and I thank Christopher Larkin as a musician that this part exists. It's so good. It's just so good. Hornet's track is beautiful both when it comes to musicality and conveying the emotions and character of Hornet. It also kind of encourages you to find out more about what she's talking about, especially since her introduction is fairly quick in the beginning. So, whenever you fight her, you want to just find out more. Plus, let's be honest, not many other tracks fit as well with the flow of the fight as this one. The flow of this battle is very sleek, and it feels very smooth to fight, both times. The track matches both Hornet's character and her fights. This is what makes the track so much better and more fitting for the situation, in my opinion. And honestly, if this track didn't exist, I really don't know what Hornet's soundtrack would sound like. This is a perfect representation of Hornet as a character, and a perfect representation for telling her story, and the story of the Kingdom of Hallownest. The story is so rich in this game. It is emotional, deep, and explains so much about the story of Hallownest, the Pale King, the Knight, and pretty much everything else involved. If it isn't already obvious, the music plays a huge role in this game's storytelling. And when I say huge, I mean huge. Oftentimes, it confirms a lot about the game that may have been shady at one point. And this comes in various ways, but one of the most common ways is from a lot of the major melodies that the game has to offer. It explains a lot through just musical language, and I'm going to focus on one particular piece of it: leitmotifs. Before I go jumping into the game and its examples, I have to talk about what a leitmotif is. For those of you who don't know, a leitmotif is something that is repeated a lot in association to something else. In music, it's usually a repeated melody or phrase that represents something. Whether that be a person, place, or thing is up to the leitmotif. Some of the easiest examples of leitmotifs that I can think of are the Avengers theme from the Avengers and, of course, Imperial March from Star Wars. Imperial March plays whenever Darth Vader is around, and even whenever he is referenced. I know that these are some pretty generic examples, but we're about to get into Hollow Knight in just a second. Anyways, these melodies are specifically created to be associated with these characters. Through time, careful examination, and analyzing a leitmotif, you can find the meaning behind it, and find what it's associated with. The two leitmotifs that are present in Hollow Knight are very, very prevalent in the story as well. The two leitmotifs are that of the Pale King and the vessels. Both of these leitmotifs are introduced to you within the first 2 minutes of playing Hollow Knight. The Pale King leitmotif is played over the Elegy of Hallownest, and the Vessel leitmotif is played first at the main menu, and then in the short intro cutscene of the knight jumping into Hallownest, the same clip that I played at the beginning of this video. These leitmotifs are played all throughout the game, hidden in the environment, boss fights, and they're even changed around a multitude of times to get different emotions out of them, just like with Broken Vessel. The Pale King leitmotif is the first one that I'd like to discuss of the two, mostly because we haven't talked about the Pale King yet, and I was saving him for the story section. There are two main iterations of this theme that I'd like to talk about, and both of them allude to the story of the royal family: the Pale King, the White Lady, and Hornet. This melody actually holds a lot of weight whenever it's compared to these two different contexts that I'm about to put it in. First, I want to discuss White Lady. The White Lady is the Queen of Hallownest. How do we know this? Well, besides the obvious fact that I'm going to be talking about the leitmotif, let's think of a couple of other things. First, she's located in the Queen's Gardens. Well, that's not enough evidence, cause so are the mantises. There's a lot of dialogue that she says relating to the Pale King. Plus, she holds half of the King's soul. The only other half is found on the Pale King's corpse in the White Palace. And on top of all of this, as a compliment, the leitmotif sits flowing on top. The soundtrack simply provides more evidence to suggest that she is the queen. The Pale King's theme plays over her domain as a soft and slow harp solo. The soundtrack here is incredibly relaxing. It gives you a vibe of a royal and motherly character, which she is. And on top of all of this, she is the knight's mother, which could be another factor as to why it sounds like this. But there's not much going on outside of the harp solo, which is really what I wanted to hit home here. This place is not really much more than just a domain for the White Lady. This is where she ran off to after the collapsing of Hallownest, and we will talk about a couple of the reasons why she's ashamed of her participation in the creation of these vessels, and why it also ended up that she bound herself. There isn't much to say about the White Lady aside from the fact that the soundtrack is a very light harp solo that intertwines with the Pale King's leitmotif. This references her royalty and obviously that she could be queen. That combined with a lot of other factors, well, you get the idea. She's pretty much obviously the queen of this place. But this is just one iteration, and it's the most basic. Let's move on to the White Palace. Remember how I said leitmotifs could represent places? Well, the White Palace is a great example of this. This piece is so much more completed, and it's what I think of whenever I think of the Pale King's leitmotif. This includes an entire arrangement of progressive lines, bass, harmonies, building, and pretty much has a full orchestra playing it. Now, it's not fully orchestrated like Pale Court is, but we will ignore that for now. Maybe I'll do a video on Pale Court another time. Regardless, I do want to talk about the way that this soundtrack works. In the beginning, there's a harp and piano playing a duet ascending repeated structure with the strings playing in the background. Retardandos or slowdowns are included at the end of each phrase to draw in your attention and to provide a transition into more instrumentations and more structure. After a while, a flute and the previously mentioned piano take over the melody. This is the leitmotif for the Pale King. This is primarily what I think of whenever I say leitmotif of the Pale King. Either that or the Elegy of Hallownest. The leitmotif is played out in its entirety and includes a few long pauses to build the tension for the release into the next segment. A cymbal roll later and the music opens wide up. Strings become much more involved with higher voices taking over the melody. The lower ones provide a firm foundation, and they all play beautifully in conjunction with each other. The piano, the flute, and the harp that is still audible at the bottom is particularly my favorite. The leitmotif is played all the way out again. This perfectly represents the palace, at least without the buzzsaws. We'll talk about that later. At the end of the leitmotif, we get one more large slowdown. This releases into a delightful dissension of scalar pattern. Shortly after, it swaps and becomes an ascension instead of a descension. This then includes kind of a call and response that's passed around between various wind instruments and the harp. And, of course, all of it allows for suspense to be built again, opening up, and finally coming back down. Right at the end, though, it does show the player the true beauty of the White Palace. Then, the slow fade-out really makes an impact. In the actual game, all of this fades down to loop once again, but you don't really hear it. My only complaint with the White Palace's soundtrack is the fact that it is covered up by buzzsaws. I felt like this was worth mentioning due to the fact that not many people listen to the soundtrack outside of the actual game, and it's hard to hear the White Palace's soundtrack except for the very first beginning of the White Palace. Considering the fact that you have to jump around these buzzsaws the whole time, you can't really hear the true beauty of the soundtrack, unless you coincidentally turn down your sound effects. Regardless though, it's still masterfully made, and it keeps the listener anticipating for what will come next. If you listen to it by itself, it's absolutely amazing. A lot of these ideas, including the entire orchestra that's playing, allow the arrangement to sound more grand, like the White Palace itself. The White Palace was the abode of the Pale King before the fall of Hallownest, and the Pale King was worshipped by many bugs. Obviously, the soundtrack has to match that, because this is where he abided. This is where he was. This is holy ground to the bugs of Hallownest. This is where the Hollow Knight was raised and trained to be able to fight off the Radiants, which is the entire cause of the infection in the beginning. So this place is a pretty big deal. I think that this soundtrack actually perfectly encapsulates the idea of royalty, and this place is really important. But it also has sorrow, because as much as this was the place where the Hollow Knight was raised, this is also the place where it was tarnished. This is part of why the Path of Pain has a completely different sound to the rest of the palace. We'll talk about that later though. For right now, I wanted to focus on how the soundtrack portrays the beauty and the grandness of the White Palace through this very royal arrangement and opus-style structure. In some areas, you can hear this sorrow definitively. The White Palace has a beautiful exterior to show, but inside, it has a tragedy to tell. This is where the Pale King also died. So once he realized he couldn't contain the infection, he retreated back to his palace, and this is where he ended up. On his body, you find a king soul part. With this part, combined with the fragment that you find with the White Lady, you can unlock the most important story element that I think is in this game. After you go through all of the platforming of the White Palace, and you find the piece of the King Soul that was missing, the player is then subtly guided to the Abyss. Once you get there, as long as you have the King Soul equipped, it initiates one of the most important story sequences this game has to offer. At the bottom of the Abyss, a new entrance to an entire new area opens up. This leads all the way down to some kind of egg object. After one dream nail, the player is sent into the Abyss Climb. The Abyss Climb is one of, and if not, it is the most important lore element of Hollow Knight, portraying the choosing of the Hollow Knight itself by the Pale King. The soundtrack that plays while we are climbing is called Sealed Vessel, but it's the birthplace variation, quote-unquote. It's weird. This is due to the fact that the Abyss is the birthplace of all of the vessels, and the cutscene is explaining the number of vessels that died in order to choose one that ultimately failed anyways. This cutscene is very emotional, and the music behind it is absolutely encapsulated. It portrays the number of vessels that were abandoned and sacrificed in order to pursue this quote-unquote pure vessel. The music takes this concept and runs with it. The vocals in the track give the authentic emotional vibe, and the strings singing behind them alludes to the buildup as the player climbs to the top. It continues on until you reach the top, which then plays the cutscene. The track falls completely silent, and the rest of the scene plays out. The Hollow Knight is chosen, and everyone else is left behind. The knight falls back to the bottom of the Abyss. Later, we find out that the choosing part of the Hollow Knight is actually a tragedy, considering at the end of the Path of Pain, we find out that the Pale King actually had a bond with this knight. The Pale King was doing everything that he could, and in the end, he still failed. This is why the Pale King and the White Lady have the amount of shame that they do. All of the deaths of these vessels, and ultimately the falling and collapsing of their kingdom, causes them to have this amount of shame. That's part of why the line, "no cost too great," means so much in this game, because the Pale King was willing to sacrifice everything in order to save Hallownest. It is also why the White Lady bound herself. She says, "These bindings about me I've chosen to erect. There is some shame I feel from my own part in the deed, and this method guarantees its cease." The White Lady saw that there was simply no other way to stop the creation of vessels than to keep herself bound away and hidden from the rest of Hallownest. However, ultimately, even the Hollow Knight failed. The music on this climb is showing that this is a sad memory, even if the knight is also supposed to be completely hollow. If we keep the Sealed Vessel track in mind, we can transition from Abyss Climb to the Path of Pain pretty easily. As I said earlier, this is where the Hollow Knight gets tarnished. The interpretations of this track go far and wide, but at the end of the Path of Pain, we see the infamous cutscene of the Pale King and the Hollow Knight standing next to each other and bonding. During this scene, the music also falls silent as the cutscene plays. Obviously, this and the Abyss Climb have similarities. Both are platforming challenges, and while the Path of Pain is easily harder than the Abyss Climb, I would say that both are important to the story with their cutscenes at the end. The Abyss Climb shows the choosing of the Hollow Knight, but the Path of Pain shows the tarnishing. The Pale King had his mind set, though, and considering the fact that he still sent the Hollow Knight out to fight the Radiants, really shows that there was no cost too great. He sacrificed the Hollow Knight to the Radiants and the Infection to keep Hallownest alive. The music with the Abyss Climb and the music with the Path of Pain specifically portray tragedy. It shows that Hallownest and the Hollow Knight were not meant to last eternal. And all of the efforts of the Pale King were in vain. Not even to mention that the silence truly means a lot. It shows that these cutscenes are important, and that they will make sense later, or that they will connect some dots in your brain now. The music of the Path of Pain and the Abyss Climb are absolutely tragic, and it shows why the Pale King not only has how much shame he does, but also explains why Hallownest collapsed in the first place. It shows the desperation of the Pale King, and ultimately his failures. The music during these two, though, are only the predecessors to the final piece that I have to talk about. This truly blew me away, and it's why Hollow Knight has my favorite soundtrack. Before I just dump all of my emotions and all of my passion onto you, I have to mention that there's a lot here, and honestly, this probably by itself, this soundtrack, deserves its own separate video. I'm not gonna lie. Regardless, Sealed Vessel plays the most accurate track that I've heard in a video game. The start of the track is no less than the ambience to the Black Egg. These cold sounds that mimic the sound of using a violin bow on a vibraphone are creepy, and they send a chill down your spine. Then, as you enter, a quiet trill starts. Then, another as you're breaking his chain, and another as you're breaking another chain. All of them layer on top of one another, creating this horribly suspenseful chord, like a pressurized can just waiting to explode, until finally you just... silence. I'm not going to play the track yet, but you can feel it, right? This is why silence is so important. Silence is probably the biggest suspense builder of all, and by creating the silence, the track is dying to release into this massive sound that fills your ears and begins the fight. Sorry if I didn't fulfill the needs of the suspense here, but after the suspense and the silence, we have something incredible. An explosion of sound as the Hollow Knight screams. Immediately, our ears are met with a full orchestra sound, full of 16th note bassline figures, ascending minor unisons, and so many instruments that it's hard to hear them all. At the top of the ascension, we get another release. The bassline trades the 16th notes with the higher strings, while they take on an 8th note pattern. On all of this, there are some long drawn-out notes that highlight the melodic line of the strings. These are their own melody and create their own feel to the music, giving epic final boss feels that every player craves at the end of a game. As the progression carries on, though, there is this absolutely chaotic melodic line, and there sounds like several key changes or just ascensions on higher notes. I'm not exactly sure. There's a lot of music theory here. The suspense that you feel whenever you build all the way up is released again back down into the original key. But now there's a descending 16th note string run going all the way down. They grow again into huge orchestral hits that create tension and are dissonant. They make you feel uncomfortable. This feels like stabbing, and there's a lot that goes into the interpretation of this music. While these hits go on, there are 16th note unison runs that go all the way down and then back up whenever the hits come back. A brass line finds itself wedged into all of this that create drones that create even more dissonance. The whole thing is just out of touch entirely, and it sounds wrong. The entire track finally decrescendos as one last hit lines up with the scream of the Hollow Knight. This is a different track entirely. Strings open up this section as deep chords resonate. Another creates a melody. The melody here is the Vessel theme, but there's no continuation. It stops and restarts. The melody ascends, but never completes. A violin goes on top of this to create an ascending minor progression that sounds like it could go on forever. This is all reminiscent of the birthplace variation earlier, the same tragic events of Hallownest and the Hollow Knight that we heard in the Abyss Climb and Path of Pain earlier. The melodic string restarts again, but this time ascends past the original point, going all the way. The whole thing builds again to finally break the tension into ending the game. This is supported with a vocal line that is followed by a huge orchestral entrance that creates a tense chord. Eventually, this releases into a full chord that signifies the end of it all. The infection, Hallownest, the tragedy, everything. At least, I wish it were that simple. Of course this game had to have multiple endings, because why wouldn't it? Specifically, the 3 from the base game. I'm not talking about DLC just yet. Maybe I will later, but let's just keep this in a box. It's gone on for too long anyway. The first ending is the Hollow Knight ending. which ends right at the huge release chord at the end of the game. This seals away the knight in the Black Egg, presumably becoming the new Hollow Knight. The second one is Sealed Siblings, which is the same as the first, but with a slight musical alteration. After the huge chord, the Pale King leitmotif plays, showing the sacrifice of Hornet when she aids you in your battle. The Dream No More ending includes something entirely different. If you listen to the Sealed Vessel official soundtrack, you'll hear it at the end. This is the ending that I want to kind of focus on more so than the others. This ending has a longer cutscene, and it uses the intro cutscene music, combines the leitmotifs together into one melody, and drifts off into the birthplace variation of Sealed Vessel. However, this time, there is a resolution. The melody finally completes itself, instead of cycling back to the first part. The leitmotif finishes into a chord, with a piano run over top of it, bringing resolution to the whole story. The music not only fits with the cutscenes, but also the fight. Like I said earlier, as the Hollow Knight stabs himself, you get these hits, these orchestra hits, but also whenever he stabs himself, the music of the second phase enters. That's where the tragic part and the sad part happens. The music fits with both endings of Hollow Knight and Sealed Siblings, but those aren't really quite as complete as they might be. Even though they might feel complete, you still don't get the resolution that Dream No More gives you. This is where the true cycle comes full circle, as we reach this ending of the game and the extremely emotional music that goes along with it. The true tragedy of this fight comes in the fact that the Hollow Knight wants to die. It knows that it's infected, and it begins to aid the player in defeating itself, which is why the stabbing is going on to begin with. Or maybe the infection must be killed via the radiance contained within. Either way, the Hollow Knight knows that it's failing, and that it needs something to happen so that the infection doesn't take over. It is still clinging on to the hollowness that it experienced before it was sent to the Black Egg. What at first seemed like a final boss has really become a cooperative battle between you, the Hollow Knight, Hornet, and the Radiance. The tragedy of Hollow Knight is realized as the player finishes the Dream No More ending. The Abyss is finally given resolve for all of the vessels that lie dead within, and all of the shades that are seeking peace can, once and for all, rest. This does not come at no cost. As the Pale King states, no cost too great. So, with the lives of both the Hollow Knights and the Knights, the Radiance is defeated. Each of the vessels fizzles down into the Abyss, and, as an extension, the full kingdom of Hallownest finds rest from the infection. At the end, we see Hornet gazing over the Knight's broken mask. We realize that this was a noble sacrifice. We realize that this costed everything. The reason why I think this track is the best one, and the most emotional in general, is because of the association with the Knight, the story, the tragic failure of the Pale King, and of course the final rest of Hallownest. But all of that, combined with the adventure that the player went on through by themselves in this forgotten land, really adds an impact. The adventure that I had while playing, and the story that the game told, changed the way that I thought I knew Hollow Knight. It changed the way that I thought about video game soundtracks as a whole. This game is a masterpiece. and the soundtrack supports it to the end. Christopher Larkin could not have made the ending to this game any more perfect. Hollow Knight really opened my eyes when it comes to video game soundtracks. It opened my eyes to a ton of small, intricate details that are simply incredible compared to that of other games. Hollow Knight honestly changed my outlook on music, the way that it conveys emotions, and what that means to me. I hope my video helped you see my experiences through Hollow Knight, the music, and the game as a whole. I hope that my thoughts weren't too erratic or too unorganized. If I'm wrong about anything, of course, I'm willing to admit it, but regardless, I still think this game's soundtrack is probably my favorite. The environments around it, the bosses and their stories, the rise and fall of Hollow Knight itself. All of this is why Hollow Knight is my favorite, and this is why I decided to analyze it. 10 out of 10, Mr. Larkin. 10 out of 10. Before I go, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my friend Foxjaw. He did a lot of work on the project in the background, getting footage, doing a couple of edits, creating thumbnails, honestly. He even bought the soundtrack for me on Steam as a gift to use in this video. He really helped me with a lot of the footage and kept the project rolling. Another huge thanks to all of you. I know it's been a long time since you last heard of me, but I hope that you forgive me whenever you see this monstrosity of a video. I hope it wasn't too unorganized, and I would like to make videos like this later. I know it's not a perfect video, but I don't think any video would be perfect. Regardless, I tried to get as close as possible, suffering through this exceedingly long endeavor as the first ideas of this were even produced. It's been a wild ride, and I've learned a lot about video editing, voiceovers, audio, received my first PC, etc. A lot of things have happened. To those of you that are new, hi, I'm Sasquatch. I have a few ideas on more videos like this, so if you don't want to miss anything, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. Leave a like on the video and comment down below about some favorite soundtracks, moments in Hollow Knight, what you love, or what you hate about the soundtrack. And tell me about how good I did on this video. It can be criticism. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching, and have a freaking awesome day.